Thank you, and it is my great honor here today to have my first academic conference presentation here today. Yeah. And today I will revisit several materials on Jiang Loder's wild gardening practice and his commitment to the plants he gardened at Wakehurst to explore how the evolving idea of wild gardening might help us to unsettle our present obsession of native and exotic. So it's still like the idea of native and exotic. So first I'll start just by a very brief introduction of what the Wakehurst place is and the general background. The present Wakehurst place comprises, as you can see here, a late 16th century Elizabethan mason and a mainly 20th century garden landscape. I'm not going into spatial details of this historical mason today, but mainly focuses on the garden landscape, on the collective plants from around the world and gardening practices that place them into the ground. This does not mean I'm treating this mason as a separate part from the landscape. Instead, I see the mason and its surrounding grounds as one integrated whole, together forming the evolving fabric of Wakehurst Place over times. And the manor of Wakehurst sits on top of one of the highest ridges of the Sussex Weald. And you can see here its exact location, and what is highlighted in the black circle is where the Wakehurst Place is. And this regional landscape of southeast England, especially its central area known as the High Weald, and provides adequate rainfall, a rich variety of natural acid and sandy soil, and undulating slopes for gold forest drainage, offering a strong typographic and climate backbone for gardening practice. So after changing hands many times, it was in 1903 when Jiang Loder, later the first Lord Wakehurst, purchased this property. He then immediately set about converting a third of the 5-acre site into a richly stocked woodland garden, as well as landscape of great botanical interest. And this famous wide woodland area, which you can also see from this 1889 survey map here, is much the C-shaped out circles there, and you can see the mason in the inner part. So Loder mainly works on the outside of the wide woodland area and to changing it into this like what current days which we know as the wide woodland area and also the West Woodland Valley, and largely benefited from contemporary botanical exploitations and the relevant ongoing influx of plant material into Britain. It is said that within the first 5 years under Loder's ownership, there were about 3,000 different species and cultivators growing at Wakehurst. And after Loder's death in 1936, the estate was bought by Sir Henry Price, who bequeathed it later in 1963 to the National Trust, which later in turn leased it to the Royal Botanical Gardens Kew. And another interesting thing I would like to share here is caught my attention is the present entrance board of Wakehurst, describing it as Kew's Wild Botanic Garden. And the word wild, to some extent, relates closely to its magnificent collection of trees and flowering shrubs, most of which were reclaimed and established during the Loder's period. Loder was known to spend hours walking up and down the woodland hills with his head gardener, searching for the ideal spot for each plant. Determined to use every inch of woodland to make his plants happy, Loder often insisted that, quote, any plant worth seeing is worth walking to, end quote. His attitude towards plants naturally recalls the idea of wild gardening, which was first introduced by William Robinson in his 1870 book, The Wild Garden, and which later became increasingly influential in the early 20th century. Robinson advocated a new kind of garden that combined woodland settings with native wildflowers and naturalized exotics. And Jiang Loder was very much part of this naturalistic version. So that's why like today I'm kind of revisiting the history of Loder's Wakehurst as the age of late imperial horticulture through a placement of the wild gardening idea within our present dialectic of native and exotic for undoing this boundary. And to further explore this kind of replacement or this kind of idea, the first triggering question I asked myself was how Loder describe those continuously imported material into his Wakehurst during that horticulture peak, as he ever used the word exotic or not. And it is said that almost daily, plants would arrive both from nursery and gardens within England or from abroad in parcels. And Loder himself also kept visiting or traveling gardens in and out the British Isles to hunt for plants. While for another archival record, which is titled the Wakehurst Notes, which is currently from the Loader paper held at Kew, are most descriptive with details, shifting from a recipient list to a diary note in terms of practical stage of physical planting. For instance, you can see here for the transcribed one, the 1912 notes mentions the exact plant date, area, and the composition of plant origin for establishing this garden area. And meanwhile, Loader has kept publishing a series of catalog books. Currently, there are 3 versions held at the library at Wakehurst, including a copied version of 1914 and origins of 1916 and 1918. And the 1914 copied version does not include a preface as the later 2 versions. I don't think I can make the conclusion at this moment that the 1916 version, the preface, which is displayed on the right of the slide here, is the first introductory writing from Loader about his intention and expectation on this kind of catalog list. But what I can confirm is that the following prefaces are much likely the same as this 1916 one. So when I read this preface, particularly its first paragraph, together with the garden notes and Wakehurst notes mentioned earlier, I began to see a whole process emerging. From the moment those moving plants being noticed and arrived in parcels, to them being tested in the garden for their adaptability and later reorganized into this catalog there. And this archival material collectively reveals a continuous horticulture stage of experimentation and acclimatization. In other words, as early as Loader's time, Wakehurst was not only a site of display, but a living wild woodland laboratory, where the original naturalization of moving plants was constantly negotiated. And another point I would like to put forward here is these catalogs actually represent more than a record of what is actually grew at Wakehurst at that time. So here also from this first paragraph here, you can see as Loader admitted, a large number of species, quote, has not been sufficiently tested, end quote. And to me, this catalog reflects Loader's key desire and pursuit of botanical richness. He saw plants primarily as a living species, rather than as either exotic or native. And tellingly, the most frequent adjective Loader used to describe a plant, which you can also see here from the highlighted one, is hardy. And up to this point, I have not found a single instance where Loader described a plant as exotic. And in the main body of these catalogs, we can see a wide range of ways to describe plant origins. What's particularly interesting, which is highlighted here in the boxes, is the overlapping of these different continental, national, and regional scales concerning specific plants and place names. And this, to some extent, reveals how fluid and sometimes blurred the classification of plant origins could be during the period of late imperial horticulture exchange, thus challenging our present binary naming of our moving plants as either exotic and native. And also here, particularly on this page, we could also see Loader's notes, such as southwestern England and the bracket one, Cornwall, which indicates the successful acclimatization of Eric vegans from southwestern Europe. So it's quite interesting to see how Loader just like put all together in parallel the names in and out of the British Isles all together into one catalog page. And based on Loader's ways of describing his receiving plants, the second part I would like to question is, how did Loader's gardening practice exemplifies his attitude towards these hardy plants he cataloged? Particularly, what kind of negotiations were made to naturalize moving plants within the original wild woodlands? And to start with, I would like to share one more page from the 1918 catalog concerning hybrid rhododendrons. One Loader added a brief note read dead, you can see here, while the corresponding 1916 one, its version contains no such remarks. So it's quite like interesting for me like to think about the small remark of dead here and further further reinforces the idea that the naturalization of moving plants was not a single act, but an ongoing and sometimes unknown process, one that could even meet a dead end. It highlights the process as a prolonged series of negotiations between a key gardener in the age of late imperial horticulture and plants living on his land. The end point of such negotiation ideally would be survival, or as Loader once described one of his rhododendron collection, quote, "It has so far proved hardy, at any rate in Sussex," end quote. And here we can see Loader used the word hardy again, to some extent as a synonym for survival. Alongside this, what I have also noticed is that Loader often recorded whether a plant flowered or not, especially for its first flowering, either in his own notes or published writings. And for instance, here on the slides, on the right image here, Loader recorded in his Wakehurst notes on the year of 1912 for finding the first flowering of Phytonia cerulata after 9 years of planting. And in this sense, revisiting Loader's wild gardening practice reveals someone who cared about the survival, or in Loader his own language, the hardness of his plants, drawing on horticultural science, genuine love of plants, as well as of his place. His correspondence with fellow gardeners, including Sir Herbert Maxwell, a conservative politician and also a key horticulturalist at that time, articulates their shared fascination, exchanging letters about plant morphology and physiology, as well as most often whether there was any plant flowered yet or not. And here you can see the top one, the transcribed one on telling the flowering of plants at that time, which Herbert shared with Loader. And another interesting thing is worth mentioning is the last 3 lines here, just right under the Herbert signature here, is indicating on the associated network circulation of plant material and knowledge, or I would prefer the alternative word of knowledge as experience. I haven't yet fully unpacked why Loader was so invested in flowering, but I think it lies somewhere between horticultural observation and aesthetic creation. It marks the point when gardening practice meets culture and imperial imagination, when the survival and flowering of an exact plant life become visible, performative, and celebratory. To cite the closest part, let me turn to one of Loader's most emblematic cases, the rhododendrons. He is known to have particular interest in rhododendrons and devote his last 33 years making the existing Weald woodlands a natural home for these plants. And I'm arguing that when these high-altitude rhododendrons from the Himalaya ecosystem arrived in Britain in the early 20th century, they entered a very different world. And in their native regions here, you can see these plants grow much on open stubble pine slopes or along the edge of spruce and fern forests, thriving in strong light as well as cool and well-drained soils. But once they reach Wakehurst, they were reimagined through the particular Weald woodland landscape traditions, planted beneath or among native oaks or beeches. They thrived in the milder climate, the diffuse light, and the damp soils of southern England. Here, rhododendrons were valued as understory or woodland edge shrubs, used to soften the woodland edge. To some extent, they came to represent a blend of ornamental design with a sense of natural continuity. In this way, what has once been wild, high mountain flower became emblematic of naturalized wild gardening at the height of imperial horticultural ambition. And for me, I cherish Loader's practice, which of course was also a regional practice, of sheltering these exotic rhododendrons underneath native oak woodlands as a regional form of moving plants, or in other words, an inward reconstructionalization of imperial botany from the regions. And undeniably, if we follow a purely binary way of distinguishing the exotic from the native, these underwood rhodes are no longer as exotic as they were when they first arrived in the British Isles. Instead, through prolonged and shifting negotiations with late imperial horticultural imaginations and particular regional landscapes, these hardy plants have become what I would call regional exotics. And this image, which is currently displayed on this slide, is the one that I took last October at Wakehurst, which you can see an oak leaf which resting right upon a rhododendron branch. So on the top is oak leaf, and on the below is a rhododendron branch. And this image is certainly not the scenery one would often encounter in Rhodes' ancestral Himalaya home. Yet it perfectly encapsulates the layered negotiation between introduction, continuous naturalization, and the regional reimagination of exotic through late imperial gardening. And of course, here I would like to add two more points here. These negotiations embedded in every cases of what I call regional exotics could vary greatly. When rhododendron became a national craze during the late imperial horticultural peak at that time, this process was not confined to the Sussex Weald, but unfolded differently across the British Isles. It would therefore be interesting to compare how much regional reconstructionization played out across the British Isles, especially given that the existing wild woodland that is so characteristic to the south are not common in the north of the British Isles. And beyond these spatial variations, there is also another point or another dimension I would like to notice is the temporal point. And here is a case of rhododendron poticum, which Paul mentioned previously. And of course, rhododendron poticum, which is not notorious across the Isles, but once it's first introduced to the British garden in the late 18th century, it was regarded as an ornamental shrub. So for me, this again suggests that the idea of regional exotic is never fixed, but continuously redefined through cultural, ecological, and temporal conditions. So return to my opening question, placing the concept of wild within the binary of native and exotic. So this kind of placement allows us to move beyond our familiar ideological reading of plant collecting and exchange history as simple another aspect of imperialism. Instead, this draws attention to how it nuances and disrupts such binary thinking with a third term, which is wild, but that is itself quite ideological, but also deeply tied to a specific style and history of gardening. And this perspective invites us to reconsider the very scale through which we examine this continuously constructed plant history in its imperial white gardening. It is not only the binary language of native and exotic that needs reassessment, but also the very idea of wild itself, especially in our current movement of enthusiasm for rewilding. So in this sense, I'm suggesting that we treasure and generally unpack the layered negotiations embedded in each case of regional exotics, and to rethink how the historical making of the wild continuously to shape and challenge our national imaginations today. So that's all what I have for today, and I think I might run out of time. But I'm also waiting for any comments and suggestions later. Thank you.